Hello everybody, my name is Kevin R. Smith and this is my most recent version of Kev Thinking Out Loud video blog recorded May 5th, 2010. Today I'd like to talk to you about an economic concept which I think we're going to be hearing a lot more about in the financial press. It has come up a few times recently, and I think we're going to be hearing a lot more about this concept, and that concept is called moral hazard. Now, moral hazard is not what you might think it is based on the way it sounds. It has nothing to do with morality, but it's an economic concept that is given rise when one party insulates another party from risk. In essence, risk is transferred from the party that takes on the transaction to a third party. It tends to, when it takes place, is to distort activities or transactions that somebody might engage in compared with if they knew they had to take on the full amount of risk of the transaction themselves. Some examples of the things that give rise to moral hazard. Recently in the press, there's been a lot of talk about the securitization of mortgages, which has been going on for the last couple of decades. And in this case, securitization means, a lending institution that is creating mortgages, conceptually bundling them up, and then selling them to other investors as a basket of mortgages. Now, the risk in any mortgage, there's a risk of default, as you could probably appreciate, and that risk is transferred to that other party. So the folks that created the loans in the first place ultimately don't have to absorb the risk of default on these mortgages. It's the folks that bought the basket of mortgages that take on that risk, and in many cases they wouldn't have the information available to them to determine what the true risk was inside the portfolio that they just bought. When moral hazard arises as a result of that, the lending institutions may feel more free to take on more risk, do lending that they wouldn't otherwise do if they had to keep the risk for themselves. Another example would be financial institutions that are deemed too big to fail. That was set in precedent that over the last several decades, anytime there's been a major financial crisis in the Western world, governments have not been willing to let large financial institutions fail. They basically prop them up through funding them directly. And if you can think of it from the point of view of these large institutions, if you knew that government was likely going to come to your rescue if you did reach the brink of failure, then you might be more inclined to take on riskier business practices, knowing that if they went afoul and bad, that government would likely bail you out. The alternative would be for government to set the precedent to let institutions completely fail. And if that were the case, the financial institutions would have to do a better job of factoring in the risk of the activities that they're actually engaging in, knowing that if they fail, nobody's going to come to their rescue. That is not what's been happening over the last 30 years. It's been the opposite. Governments have not been willing to let large institutions fail. Another example would be defined benefits pension plans, which is an example that applies to many individuals around the world. In a defined benefits pension plan, the employee and the employer put money into a pension trust fund, which is designed to grow and pay out a defined benefit to the pensioner when they're ready to retire. Well, those assets are still invested in different things like stocks and bonds, and maybe even securitized mortgages I just referred to. That risk is not visible to the member, to the employee. So they're insulated from that risk, or at least they think they are. So the things that they demand from their employer with respect to compensation packages or pension benefits may be excessive compared with if they had to take on those risks themselves and absorb them themselves. Now, they still may end up facing that risk. In fact, many companies, vast majority of defined benefits pension plans around the world, I would think, are vastly underfunded right now. And we're going to be hearing more and more about this topic, I think, as the years roll on. So the risk there from the member's point of view still may be faced, because if their employer has gone bankrupt and there isn't enough money in the pension trust to pay out the benefits as defined, then something's going to give, meaning lower benefits. And that's not something that most of these folks would have been expecting. Another example would be, in public policy, would be EI insurance, unemployment insurance. If a potential wage earner had to pick a career path in the absence of unemployment insurance, they would probably be more inclined to pick career paths where the risk of unemployment is lower, where the perhaps availability of work would be higher, and the demand for those skills would be higher. Well, with unemployment insurance programs, that diminishes, I guess, the power of those types of decisions, because in all likelihood, if you qualify for unemployment insurance, you're never without income. So it can result in an inefficient choice, I guess, of where labor goes to work and what skills that it acquires. Another example that's been in the news a great deal in the last few days or weeks, and perhaps we'll hear more about it in the days ahead, is country bailouts. Greece is in the news quite a bit right now. Greece is asking for assistance from its European neighbors and the IMF. It has a massive budget shortfall. It has very large social programs which have obviously become far too expensive. The moral hazard in this case is if they do get bailed out and the austerity, without severe conditions, austerity measures and reining in the budget being attached to that money, then there's significant moral hazard here, because other neighboring countries around the world may look at Greece as an example and say, well, they didn't let Greece fail. Greece overbuilt its social programs. The people never really had to pay too high a price, and they got the bailout. So citizens in neighboring countries may decide, well, there's really not much risk if we hit the debt wall. So there's potential for moral hazard there as well. Now, it's not likely that's going to be the case. Greece will have to suffer greatly, unfortunately, for their citizens, and the countries that don't want to follow the path of Greece will need to take measures right now. So those are some examples of how moral hazard comes to be. It's public policy, could be legislation, could be regulation, could be precedent. So why is it important? Well, moral hazard masks the true risk that we face as individuals and as societies. So you see, the risk isn't eliminated. It's simply transferred from one party to another. And that risk can still materialize, and if it does, then we will ultimately face it either as individuals or as a society. Why am I bringing it up now? Is because there is, in my opinion, a massive appetite amongst the public of all the developed nations around the world for government to do more to insulate its citizens from risk. Demands for things like financial regulation to protect individuals against what's perceived to be unfair lending practices. Also for enhanced benefits for EI, unemployment insurance.